one of the difficulties for Western people about the Quran is that in some ways it's a non-linear book. This is probably in some ways worst articulated by Thomas Carlyle when he did his famous lecture series in the United Kingdom on heroes and hero worship. And quite scandalously, he used the Prophet Muhammad as a prophetic hero, which caused great consternation to the Anglican bishops. But it was an interesting time in the UK because the English were at war in many Muslim areas, not so dissimilar to our time now. And some of the best of the English at the time, and I'm speaking now as somebody with a lot of Irish ancestry, some of the best of the English at the time actually were deeply troubled by the misunderstandings between Islam and between Europe. And some of them, like Edwin Arnold, who was an editor at the Daily Telegraph, and a very interesting man. There's two that with similar names, but he's actually in the famous 11th edition of the encyclopedia. But he wrote a book called The Light of Asia about the life of Buddha, trying to educate English people about Buddhism because they were also occupying many Buddhist countries. But then he wrote a book about Islam called The Pearls of Faith, which I'm hoping to republish that book because I found it quite extraordinary that somebody of such high stature in that society was so distraught about the misunderstandings and lack of communication that he desired to actually spend so much time doing it. But Thomas Carlyle said about the Quran that it was one of the most difficult readings that he'd ever done, and if this is a masterpiece of rhetoric, where do we put Homer and Shakespeare and others? And Arabs invariably will say, well, the problem is you don't know Arabic. And to a large extent, as somebody who spent a great deal of time learning an incredibly difficult language, I would definitely concur with that statement. The Quran is very much an Arabic book in that it was revealed in the language of the Arabs, but it is not an Arabian book. And that's a very important distinction. The Quran has only one chapter that in some ways is similar to the Bible, which is a much easier book to read for Western people because it's very linear, which is the 12th chapter of Joseph or Yusuf, which is a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The way the Quran works is sometimes it's here, sometimes it's there. In fact, in Arabic, there is a rhetorical device that we actually, as far as I know, do not use in the English language. It's called iltifat. And it is to switch, for instance, you go from you to I to he. And so in switching in that way, it can be quite disruptive for a Western reader and make it very difficult. Why is it doing that? Part of the reason that the commentators give is that God has all perspectives. And so to speak only in first person is to speak only from one perspective. But another reason is like a Zen koan, it's intended to wake you up. Hence it's called iltifat. I'll give you an example. In the opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, it begins in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim reiterates the merciful, the compassionate. Maliki Yawmiddin or Maliki Yawmiddin, there's two variants, or there's actually more than two, but those are the two dominant ones. The possessor, the master of the day of judgment, the sovereign of the day of judgment, or the day the debts fall due. And then it goes, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. It switches to a direct address. To you we worship. So it begins by talking about God as if God was not present, and suddenly it moves in which you're directly addressing God. The commentators say that the reason for this is when you enter into the prayer, the heart takes time to enter into the divine presence. And at the point that you say, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, it is the point that you should be in the divine presence. So it opens, God is greater, and then you begin praising God, and then you enter into your discourse with God. So one of the interesting things about our time is that we have this deconstructionist movement in literary studies where they show the inherent contradictions in a lot of literary works. One of the challenges of the Quran is to show the contradictions in it, because it says if it was from other than God, it would have many contradictions in it. And there are several tafsirs that deal with what they call the deep structure of the Quran, that it has a superficial randomness, but the deeper you go into it, the more structure you begin to take from it. This obviously takes a long time to do. The example that the Quran uses is that it says, لا أقسم بمواقع النجوم in Surah Al-Waqi'ah. I swear by the positions of the stars. That also means the positions of the verses in the Quran. It's tawriya in Arabic rhetoric. It's a double entendre. So it can mean the position of the stars. It can also mean the position of the verses in the Quran. And it says, وَإِنَّهُ لَقَسَمٌ لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عَظِيمٌ. If you but knew, this is a vast oath. One of the things about the stars, as somebody who spent time studying astronomy and lived in the Sahara in West Africa, and one of the reasons why I believe that atheism is much more widespread today than at any other time is because of artificial light. Because I truly believe that if people could actually see the stars in all their glory without any light, as I have seen them, on occasion it reduced me to tears just looking at the stars. You know, the beautiful verse in the Bible that says, the heavens declare your glory. You can really understand that verse if you're out in the middle of the Sahara on a completely moonless night with all the stars, as if you could reach out and pluck them from that canopy. And Plato said, if it wasn't for the stars, how could we come to know God? I would love that our society would just turn off the lights every once in a while, maybe once a month, have all the lights in the cities just turned off so people could see the stars and be reminded of something. The word desire, in its root meaning, means to seek out the stars. That we are heavenly directed by our nature, hence getting high. This verse says that your Lord, and here your is in the singular to the Prophet Muhammad, your Lord said to the angels, and I'm not going to go into the literal and figurative debates in between fundamentalists and between traditionalists, because these debates are endless. But what it says literally is your Lord said to the angels, I am placing in the earth a caliph, a khalifa. The word khalifa in Arabic has several meanings. One of the meanings is somebody who absolutely stands in place and represents. Another is a steward, somebody who takes care of things. Like when you go on a journey, one of the things you say in the prophetic tradition is, oh Allah, I'm leaving you as my caliph, my khalifa for my family and my wealth. So, in other words, I'm leaving you to take care of them. So it says, I'm placing in the earth a vicegerent, sometimes it's translated, a caretaker, a steward. I'm placing in the earth this caliph. And the angels say, are you going to place in it one who sows corruption and sheds blood? And we praise your glory and deem you holy. And God's reply is, I know what you do not know. This question of the angels is a very interesting question. There's a lot of debate about why they asked this question. All the commentators are in agreement. They weren't disagreeing with God. They were just asking a question because in Muslim tradition, before humans were here, there were spirits, that were here, and they sowed a lot of corruption. And then there was another, Iblis was sent down to take control, and he did that. And so some say that the angels were looking at the previous inhabitants of the earth that sowed corruption and said, are you going to do this again? And the verse replies, I know what you do not know. But what's interesting in their question, they asked two things. Will you place in the earth one who sows corruption? Fasad is a beautiful word in Arabic. It has a very negative connotation, but it's beautiful in that it encompasses all of these different types of human vileness. It can actually mean pollution. It can mean corruption. It can mean something like when food goes bad, the Arabs say fasid, right? When food goes bad. And the second thing they say, and will you shed blood? Our commentators say this refers to two components in the human being because we are triune creatures according to most of the ancient traditions. The Greeks had the soma, the psyche, and the pneuma. There are many trinities in the human character. But the one here that the Muslims argue, which is found also in the Greek tradition, is this idea of the human beings having this body that has appetites and it has emotions. And when the appetites take control, it sows corruption when they're not controlling the appetites. And when the emotion of anger takes control, the worst thing that can happen is murder. And very few people kill. There are definitely psychopaths out there, but most murders happen in moments of rage. Most domestic violence happens in moments of rage, when people are angry. A husband doesn't think, should I go hit her? Would that really be the best thing to do in this situation? It's usually this lower nature takes over. This irascibility in the soul takes over, and they do this. And so the appetites and the emotions are what cause this corruption and what cause this bloodshed. And so the Quran says that the reply to this is, I know what you don't know. What is that thing, and why is that word used twice? Because knowledge is used over 800 times in the Quran. It's one of the most recurring words in the Quran as a thematic word, knowledge. I know what you don't know. And then it says, and we taught Adam the names. And this is the Adam that is Adam and Hawa. It's the Adam before the separation. We taught Adam the names, all of them. And then we showed those names to the angels, and they said and said to the angels, tell me the names of these things if you are truthful in what you've said. And they said, glory to you, we only know what you have taught us. We have no knowledge except what you have taught us, and you are the wise and the all-knowing. And then it says to Adam, tell the names, and Adam told the names. And when he told the names, God says, didn't I tell you that I know the unseen of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you were concealing, what you were revealing about man, that he will sow corruption and man will shed blood, and what you were concealing, that this is a learning creature. It's a creature that knows things and can acquire knowledge. And then it goes on, the story goes on, and then he tells the angels to bow down to Adam because of this superiority. And then it says all of them bowed down except Iblis, he refused. And then it said, live in this garden, but don't go near this tree. And so most of you are familiar with that from the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition. Don't go near the tree, which is not in Islam considered the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's just a test. Don't go near this tree. You can eat anywhere you want, but don't eat this tree. The devil says, This tree will give you eternal life, and it will give you a dominion that will never perish. And so you should eat from it. And so they eat from the tree. The woman's not blamed in the Quranic narrative. They both actually take responsibility. But what's interesting is they take responsibility. And the word that's used in the Quran that happens to them is azalluhuma, shaitan. Like shaitan, the devil tripped them, caused them to trip. So this, what is known in Christianity as the original sin, the fallen nature, in the Quran it's described as a slip. And now it says, go down, one of you an enemy to the other. In other words, the devil an enemy to man, go down to the earth for a time. And guidance will come. Whoever follows that guidance, I will bless him. And if you don't, then be forewarned. And so this is the narrative in the Quran of the human condition. That the human being has this nature that has knowledge, so the ability to reason, the ability to acquire knowledge, but it also has these two other components, these emotions that get the best of us, and these appetites that sometimes overwhelm us. And obviously, the two dominant ones are lust and the appetite for food. Hence, Imam al-Ghazali, in his famous work called Reviving the Sciences of Islam, Imam al-Ghazali says, he has a book called Breaking the Two Desires. Breaking the two desires. The desire of the stomach and the desire of the genitals. Because this is the source that if one can control these two elements in our nature, that we can live without sowing corruption and without shedding blood. But if we allow these two aspects of our nature to take over, we lose this ability. And according to the Quranic narrative, the way this is done is acquiring knowledge. And this is why the great Orientalist Franz Rosenthal, who wrote a wonderful book called Knowledge Triumphant. He also translated Ibn Khaldun's extraordinary work, the Muqaddimah. Franz Rosenthal said, I know of no other civilization, and this is a world-class historian. He said, I know of no other civilization in human history that put the acquisition, the development, and the transmission of knowledge at the very center of their purpose. That this was the ethos of Islamic civilization. And this is why knowledge, particularly knowledge of language, although they had a great interest in the quantitative sciences of mathematics. Obviously, we know algebra from al-jabr wa taqabul, which is jabr is fixing broken things. And so algebra is that. Gibberish comes from Jabir bin Hayyan, because some of the medievals found his work so difficult they called it gibberish. The central study of Muslim civilization was the language arts. And the work that was done very early on in lexicons, in grammar, in rhetoric are stunning. To this day, they're being studied with interest. And there's actually a PhD dissertation that a Palestinian wrote, arguing that a lot of Noam Chomsky's best ideas came out of Kufan and Basran grammarians from the 3rd and 4th century. Whether that's true or not is for the academics to work out. Great minds do think alike. Fools seldom differ. But great minds do think alike. So sometimes people just have the same insights. Leibniz and Newton apparently discovered calculus at about the same time, which is quite extraordinary, but things do happen like that in the world. So the acquisition of knowledge becomes really at the center of the Islamic tradition. The very first word that is revealed in the Quran is Iqra. Bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your Lord. Read. Iqra. This is why there's a wonderful book that was written about the love of libraries and the fact that in many Muslim countries, the most prized possession in the house was the library. often people showed their libraries off. Sevilla in Spain, and I lived in Spain, and Seville is known as a party town. Seville was also known as a party town 1,000 years ago. And Ibn al-Arabi, the great Quranic exegete, said, if a musician dies in Cordoba, he has to send his instruments, the family sends the instruments to Seville to be sold. But if a scholar dies in Seville, they have to send the books to Cordoba to be sold. But this really was at the center of Islamic civilization. Now, the Prophet Muhammad said, be a scholar, be a student of knowledge, be a helper of the two, or be a lover of those. But don't be, Abdul Aziz ibn Umar added something to that. He said, don't be the fifth one and perish. And so the commentators say that the Prophet left that door open. That if you were not somebody who was actively seeking knowledge and acquiring it, at least be somebody facilitating that, like the wonderful people that built Yale University, right? Because it wouldn't be here without those people that give their money to support that. Or be, at least if you can't afford to help them, love them. I'll give you an example. One of the greatest scholars in the history of Islam is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Abu Hamid was born in a poor family. His father was a wool carder. His father loved the scholars, and his great prayer was that God would make his sons scholars. He died, and the sons were left orphaned. Both Abu Hamid and his brother Ahmed became two of the greatest scholars in the history of Islam, particularly Abu Hamid. And this was something, like every Irish family gave at least one of their children to the priesthood. Every Muslim family wanted, or to the nunnery. Every Muslim family wanted at least one of their children to be a scholar. This was so deeply rooted in the Islamic ethos. So it really saw the pursuit and love of knowledge as at the root of the human condition. Now, having said that, some of the most beautiful human beings that I have ever met, and this is a true story. I was in West Africa, and it was a very dark night. Our car got stuck in mud in the middle of the Sahara, literally. And we walked a ways because somebody had told us that there's an encampment in this certain area. We found a Bedouin who was a sheep herder, illiterate. He was so happy. And he was the only person out there with his goats and sheep. He was so happy to see us. He went, he slaughtered a goat, he fed us. It was an extremely windy night with a lot of rain. When we woke up, he had stayed the whole night holding the centerpiece of the tent to make sure that it didn't collapse on us. That was his hospitality, because we were his guests. And the Prophet said, whoever believes in God in the last day, let him honor the guest. And that was, somebody who was with me from England could not believe it. This man had actually deprived himself of sleep in order to ensure that we slept. Some of the best people that I have met in this world have been illiterate, simple believers. And that's the truth. And I have absolutely no contempt for those people at all. What I see is that some people are facilitated to learn. The circumstances are ripe for them to learn, and other people are deprived of that. The people that do have the gift of learning should actively be engaged in trying to spread that gift to other people, because learning in the true sense of the word, not learning for a degree, not learning to become somebody of stature or somebody of wealth, but learning really for the sake of God and our tradition. And the Prophet Muhammad said one of the signs of the latter days is that people will learn for other than the sake of God. So at the root for me, and I can only speak for myself, I'm technically speaking on behalf of a tradition, but that is far too weighty as far as I'm concerned, and I think it's an example of the impoverished state of our community that people like me actually represent the tradition. And I don't say that humbly, I say that knowing what the tradition is, spending a good part of my life in it, and reading. When I hear people call ISIS medieval, it really upsets me, because I spent a lot of time with medieval scholars, and I know for a fact that they would have nothing to do with these people. And in fact, if those people would actually read these people, they certainly would not be doing what they are doing. And I think, unfortunately, the medieval period gets a bad rap. I think people would really be stunned at what they find. And just to give you one example, I'm going to read from one of the greatest representatives of our tradition. And this is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who writes about why people disbelieve. And he says, and he died in 1111, so this is 1,000 years ago. Firstly, there are some who, failing to find God by observation, conclude that there is no God, and that this world of wonders made itself, or existed from everlasting. They are like a man who, seeing a beautifully written letter, should suppose that it had written itself without a writer, or had always existed. People in this state of mind are so far gone in error that it is of little use to argue with them. Such are found amongst the physicists and astronomers in particular. Right? So 1,000 years ago, you had the same debates and arguments. These are not new debates. In fact, people forget that Karl Marx did his dissertation on Greek materialists, the people that Socrates was going around destroying their arguments. So it's not like they haven't always been here. They've always been here, and they will always be here. And they're part of, from our perspective, as a believer, they're part of God's creation. And one of the wonderful things that Hafiz, the great Persian poet, said, if you saw that the world were all guests of God, and you understood that this was a banquet that He invited them to, how would you treat those guests, even the rude ones? Ghazali says that the world is like a banquet, and God has put out these silver and gold plates and perfume, but it's a banquet where you come and then you have to leave and another group comes and then they leave and another group comes. He said what you should do is go in, eat the meal, smell the perfume, and be deeply grateful for the banquet and show that gratitude. And then he said, and then leave. He said what some people do is they start taking the silver and gold plates and tucking them away for themselves. And so I think that it's very difficult in these days to represent traditions. There are a lot of things in traditions that people see as odious. They see them as hateful, or they see them as discriminatory. And I think a lot of tradition is problematic. One of the things that we teach our students at Zaytuna is that tradition is inheriting a lawsuit. And you have to recognize that there are ongoing debates, and these debates have to be brought out again. There's no double jeopardy in tradition. Right? So we have to debate these things, and trying to understand our traditions in the light of the world we're living in is very difficult, because it is a confusing world. Particularly, we've lost a lot of the things that have enabled us in the past to be much more human. One of the things in these verses that I read out, one of the things that I think they indicate is that adversity is part of life. And this is certainly in the Quranic narrative. And there's a reason for adversity. We learn through adversity. We learn often compassion from our own suffering. We learn to be compassionate with others. Empathy is one of the most important qualities in all of our religious traditions. And to be empathic to be an empath is actually quite difficult in this world. There are people that suffer greatly because they so much feel the pain of other people and have very difficult times. And then we also have sociopaths, and they're very real. And these people, it's estimated, I read one book, The Sociopath Next Door, that estimated that about 1 out of 20 people in the United States is sociopathic. That's quite a large number. That means there are probably a few in the audience tonight, you know. And some of them function quite well and learn to at least pretend to be empathic because they know that it's decorum. But then others simply don't care. They can eliminate large numbers of people like Stalin or Bashar Assad, or literally eliminate large numbers of people without, I mean, they say Hitler used valerian to sleep at night, but it's amazing because I've tried valerian and it doesn't work that well. I mean, so I would think he would have needed propofol like what Michael Jackson was using. But if you're sociopathic, you're not losing sleep over killing large numbers of people, it would appear. And so this is our challenge. For me, living a good life is trying to learn this knowledge of my tradition, which says that the real purpose of our existence here is to come to know God. Not in the way that angels know God, which is immediate knowledge, but to know God through difficulty, through hardship, through suffering. And in coming to know God, the soul is expanded. One of my favorite metaphors from the pre-modern world that was used in the Christian tradition, and I actually found it in a verse in the Quran in Surah Yunus, is the Wheel of Fortune. One of the most important works of the medievals was the Boethius book, The Consolation of Philosophy. And in the second chapter, he uses this metaphor of the Wheel of Fortune, fortuna, fate, that says in the tradition, you can't worship me. In other words, you cannot placate me, I do what I will. But in the Wheel of Fortune, and this is in the chapter of Yunus, where it says that we cause you to, nusayyirukum, like yusayyirukum means to cause you to go around, right? In the land and in the sea. And when you're in a ship and a good wind comes, everybody rejoices and is happy. But then they see a storm off in the distance, and then they begin to feel something. And then the waves begin to pile up. And until they think that they're going to be destroyed. And they call on God in absolute sincerity. Oh, just save us from this and we will be grateful. Right? This is the bargain with God when troubles happen. A lot of people do this, by the way. It's a very common event. But in the Wheel of Fortune, you had regno, which was I rule. And joy was the emotion associated with that. So farihu biha, it says in the Quran, they rejoiced in this. And then you have regnave at 3 o'clock, which is I used to rule. Right? So they're on their way down. And the appropriate response for that is fear. And then you have the 6 o'clock, which is I used to rule. Right? And then you have the 9 o'clock, which is regnabo, I shall rule. So it's this hope. Part of the purpose of these medieval people, and they understood this, was to get into the hub so that the wheel no longer affected you, to enter into the hub, the eye of the hurricane, so that the world and all of its vicissitudes and calamities and all of these hardships that happen in the world, that you're in this center of stillness. And that stillness, according to our tradition, can only come from the remembrance of God. And this is why if there is a fundamental sin in Islam, they debated on whether it was pride, which is the sin of the devil. But Imam al-Junayd said the fundamental sin of the human being is acedia. It's his distractibility. And boredom. Kierkegaard says once God is removed, people are left with boredom. And so they will pursue all these pursuits, what they called the early Christian desert fathers called the noonday devil. And when you read the descriptions of how the noonday devil afflicts them, you see that they're distracted and looking at the window, and see, like now, people looking on their cell phones. I was on the airplane 2 days ago, and I was sitting next to a man, that was furious that the internet wasn't working, and said, how dare they advertise? I can't be off this thing for more than 15 minutes. And the whole flight, he was so agitated, like just moving. And this is what they call acedia, sloth, spiritual. It's a spiritual sickness, and it has afflicted our civilization to the utmost degree. We are afflicted with profound boredom, and we're constantly attempting to distract ourselves with drugs, with sex, with money, with pursuit of fame, pursuit of power, of all these things that the Prophet Muhammad said the truest thing that the poet ever spoke was that, "Ala kullu shay'in ma khala Allah batilu." Everything other than Allah is vanity.